But now, without any further ado, it's time for the highlight of today's conference. And I'm very honored and happy to welcome Professor Andrew Chadwick to Tartu and to AoIR 2017. So, Professor Andrew Chadwick is now a professor in the political communication in the Center for Research in Communication and Culture and the Department of Social Sciences at Loughborough University. Most of his research has explored the internet and newer media as they relate to three broad areas of political communication: political mobilization, democratic engagement, and news and journalism. Professor Chadwick first joined Royal Holloway, University of London, as a lecturer in January 2001 and was then promoted to senior lecturer in 2004. And also awarded a personal chair as Professor of Political Science 4 years later. He has held visiting fellowships at Oxford Internet Institute, a visiting scholarship at the American Political Science Association Centennial Center, Washington, D.C., and in 2007 was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society for Encouragement of Arts, Manufacturers and Commerce. From 2006 to 2009, he served as head of the Department of Politics and International Relations at Royal Holloway and led to the expansion of the department, which saw it more than double in size during those years as he laid the foundations for emergence as a new center of excellence in teaching and research. Professor Chadwick has also been awarded 2 Teaching Excellence Prizes at Royal Holloway in 2006 and 2013. But when talking about research, then Professor Chadwick's latest book is The Hybrid Media System, Politics and Power, by Oxford University Press, which was awarded the 2016 International Journal of Press Politics Book Award for an outstanding book on media and politics, published in the previous 10 years, and American Political Science Association Information Technology and Politics Section Best Book Award in 2014. His book, Internet, Politics, States, Citizens, and New Communication Technologies from 2006 was awarded the American Sociological Association Best Book Award and is among the most widely cited works in its field. Andrew is also editor of the book series, Oxford Studies in Digital Politics, which currently features 21 titles. And his writing has also appeared in a very range of edited books and scholarly journals. So today's keynote speech is entitled Donald Trump, the 2016 US Presidential Campaign, and the Intensification of the Hybrid Media System. So I welcome Professor Chadwick. The floor is yours.
Okay, bear with me while I switch slides. Okay, well, how can I follow the announcement about the reflector? I've never heard so many people start talking to each other in a room simultaneously. So I haven't got mine, of course, so I'm going to be breaking the law as I walk back to the hotel, but never mind. Listen, it's a real privilege and an honor to be here, and it's so great to see so many of you who've made the walk down from the conference venue. I'd just like to thank Jenny and Andra and Axel and the rest of the committee for inviting me, and particularly Andra for being so responsive on email and dealing with my wacky requests over the last few weeks. Thanks ever so much. So today I want to talk about a new chapter that I wrote in the second edition of my book, The Hybrid Media System, which came out just a couple of months ago. And if you're interested in my work and you're interested in this whole idea, you can look at a section of my website, which I've grandly called Projects, which will take you to a range of different publications beyond the book, journal articles that I've worked on over the last 4 or 5, 6 years with other people as well. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you a kind of theoretical blast in the opening kind of 7 or 8 minutes, if you're not familiar with this framework. And then I'm going to talk about Trump in 2016, and I'm going to get into the weeds of the empirics of that situation to try and move forward with some kind of understanding of what went on. You know, I'm not going to pretend that I've got all the answers, far from it, but I think we're still in the situation now where we need to try and understand just the basics of what happened before we start jumping to all kinds of conclusions. So I want to start by saying that it's pretty clear that political communication and communication more generally is in the middle of a rather chaotic transition period, and this has been induced by the rise of digital media. And what I've tried to do with this project is develop a way, but it's by no means the only way, to explore this transition and to try and understand how power works amid the chaos. Now, as Carolyn Marvin argued in her book, When Old Technologies Were New, old and new are relative terms. So let's reinforce that by using the terms older and newer media. Also, I'd like us to try to integrate the study of older and newer media in politics. Let's try and develop holistic approaches that help us map where the distinctions between older and newer media matter and where those distinctions are dissolving. And let's also examine renewed media, by which I mean older media that adapt and integrate the logics of newer media. I think this requires a systemic perspective, but this needs to be rooted in specific illustrations of forces in flow and not abstract structural prejudgments and crude statistical snapshots. And I think the key to all of this is some sort of conceptual understanding of power, and one that can be illustrated empirically. And I'm not saying I have all the answers, far from it. So here it is in a nutshell. The hybrid media system is built on interactions among older and newer media logics, where logics are defined as technology, genres, norms, behaviors, and organizational forms in the reflexively connected fields of media and politics. Actors in this system are articulated by complex and ever-evolving relationships based upon adaptation and interdependence, and concentrations and diffusions of power. So actors create, tap or steer information flows in ways that suit their goals and in ways that modify, enable, or disable the agency of others across and between a range of older and newer media settings. So this project examines this systemic hybridity in flow, in information consumption and production patterns, in newsmaking, in parties and election campaigns, in activism, and in government communication. And it adopts a mix of methods: conceptual work, historical analysis, documentary analysis, live online research, surveys, and a bit of statistical analysis and insider ethnography as well. So I want to dig a bit deeper into the ontology of this particular approach before getting to the really juicy stuff, the good stuff about Trump. So there's an ontology of hybridity, and it's been used across the social sciences. So for example, in political science, we have this notion of hybrid regimes. In communication, cultural, and media studies, we have this notion of hybrid cultures and hybrid genres, which goes back a long way. In organization studies, we have hybrid organizational norms and structures. And of course, there's the big one, science and technology studies, with its actor-network theory model of hybrid networks of human and technological agents, or actants, as Bruno Latour famously called them. So hybridity, I would argue, offers a powerful way of thinking about politics and society because it foregrounds complexity, interdependence, and transition. It nudges us away from either-or binaries towards not only but also forms of thinking. And it draws attention to boundaries, to flux, to in-betweenness, and how practices intermesh and co-evolve. So this basic ontology goes on to inform two theoretical pillars of this research. First, power, and second, the idea of a system. So obviously power and the idea of a system, these have both been absolutely central to the social sciences, so this isn't the place to rehearse the debate, so just let me sketch out my thinking very briefly. First of all, understanding power obviously involves looking at the relations between social actors in the classic Weberian model of sociology, but less obviously, of course, we need to look at the relations between actors and media technologies. And by exploring exchanges among social actors and how media are used in and come to shape those exchanges, we can get inside power relationships empirically. And we can take this a stage further and say that these many and diverse interactions aggregate to constitute systems. Now, systems are often flexible and adaptable, but they might be hierarchical, relatively fixed, and based upon asymmetrical power relations. On the other hand, they might be horizontal, or based on horizontality, fluidity, and more symmetrical power relations. And I'm a big fan of Brian McNair's book, Cultural Chaos, which came out in 2006. And it's the idea that we can say that systems have varying degrees of complexity, instability, and messiness, and they often undergo long and chaotic periods of change. Now, a further point about systems is that they're based upon competition and conflict. Yes, but there's also a great deal of interdependence among actors in a system. Even the most powerful need to cooperate with those who are less powerful in the pursuit of collective goals. And those who are powerful in one social field might not be powerful across all social fields. These aspects of systems sometimes give those who appear to have lots of power in the first place, or rather those who appear not to have much power in the first place, the capacity to force those who do have power to adapt and change their behavior. So in other words, building upon what Manuel Castells has taught us, power is relational and it becomes a matter for detailed empirical investigation in that moment. And of course, systems are based upon a division of labor as well that emerges among actors in the pursuit of goals, especially in important large-scale social structures like media and politics. Because these things can't be undertaken without some embedded, regularized ways of managing cooperation over time. Now, these might be formal bureaucratic types of organization, but increasingly, of course, as everyone in this room knows, they aren't. Digital media are forms of communication, but they're also forms of organization today. And today, the structures for cooperation in civic life are relatively loose. Not all of them, of course, but many of them are relatively loose, ad hoc and spontaneous, and they're continually adapted according to the goals that are being pursued. In other words, they can be understood as assemblages. So here, of course, I'm drawing upon Manuel de Landa's work, and all of this goes back to Deleuze and Guattari and their famous essays on the idea of the assemblage from the late 1960s onwards. So my take on assemblage theory is that there are essentially permeable boundaries between different entities in any collective endeavor. And the meaning and force of any entity, whether it's a person, a group, a technology, a linguistic frame, a street or a building, and so on, can only be understood in terms of its interactive and interdependent relations with other entities. So as my analyses of news have shown, political newsmaking is increasingly carried out in these assemblages as digital technologies enable individuals and collectives to plug themselves into the newsmaking process, often in real time and strategically. And that brings me to the two final points in the theoretical framework. Power and systems are dependent upon time. So embedding norms by acting with regularity, that's an important part of exercising power in a system, but so too is acting with timeliness, which is something a bit different. The mastery of temporal rhythms is an important and surprisingly under-researched social force in communication. But if you think about it, the ability to act, create and act on information in a timely manner, especially in real time, is key to exercising power. Political and media actors try to master time. They often shock and surprise to get ahead of the game, or they deliberately delay, drag information from the archives and give it new life. And I think the important point is that temporal power is now enabled and constrained in different ways by different media. And finally, systems need to be enacted, reenacted, and there's a process of incremental change over time. But importantly, this is a crucial part of my argument, and it draws upon social constructionism. Those who play the important roles in building a system are able to exercise power within it as you move forward. So in this project, I've tried to explore all of this by examining the hybrid media system in flow in various different contexts. And there now follows a sort of quick and dirty version of how I went about that in relation to the 2016 US campaign. So there's lots to say. There's far more detail in the book. The chapter itself's about 23,000 words long. So, I got a bit excited and it just poured out of me because I was watching this unfold and I thought, good Lord, this is incredible. And I'm sure we all did. So there's a lot more detail in the book, and I'm going to skip through some of this very, very quickly. I want to give you a lot of information, so I'm going to try and press a lot of different buttons in the room. Some of it you might find very empirical, some of it you might find conceptual, so hopefully you'll get your, you'll get your fix of what you need. So I'm going to start with a photo. This is a photo of Trump's first day in office. All but one of these people has now been fired. Yeah? So Reince Priebus, Chief of Staff, Steve Bannon, Chief Strategist, Sean Spicer, Communications Director, Mike Flynn, National Security Advisor. Three of these people, Priebus, Bannon, and Spicer, occupied the three most important strategic roles in the White House. So I'm going to begin with some optimism, okay? Trump's White House has been in chaos since day one. And I'm going to begin by trying to explain one reason why. And this involves a crowd, or rather two specific crowds, plus hundreds of other crowds around the world. So take yourself back to inauguration weekend, January the 20th to the 22nd, when Trump was inaugurated. Sean Spicer, his press officer, has a problem. Spicer is Donald Trump's new White House press secretary. Earlier that day, Donald Trump walks out of the Capitol building to be formally inaugurated as 45th President of the United States. He delivers an uncompromising, combative speech that echoes all of the themes of his campaign. It was a big day of celebration for Trump and his staff, including Spicer. But as Trump emerges from the Capitol building, sitting on an observation platform close to the top of the famous stone needle that is the Washington Monument, was Lucas Jackson, 500 feet above the ground and breathless from having climbed 50 flights of stairs. Jackson is a well-known photojournalist for Reuters, the highly respected, second oldest, second largest news agency in the world. And at 12:01, with Trump on the stage, Jackson takes a picture of the inauguration crowd and uploads it to his editorial office at Reuters. The staff at Reuters pull out an old photo of Obama's 2009 inauguration and compare it with Jackson's photo. The differences, of course, are stark and newsworthy. At 2:02 p.m., Reuters publishes on their website this composite image of the two crowds side by side. The Obama inauguration photo shows crowds almost completely filling the National Mall, stretching all the way back to the National Monument and spilling over into Madison and Jefferson Drives. The Trump photo shows the crowd starting to thin out about halfway down the mall, and it didn't reach the monument. So Reuters' message was clear: Trump could not draw a crowd like Obama could. Rewind to a few weeks earlier. This is Teresa Shook. She's a Hawaii resident. She created an event page after Trump had won the election on Facebook, calling for a women's rights march to protest against Trump for his misogynistic remarks during the campaign. The following morning, she wakes up to find the links has been distributed to women's groups online, including Pantsuit Nation, which was a closed Facebook group that was established to galvanize support for Hillary Clinton. As word of this protest spreads online, a large coalition of organizations begins to grow around it, including these: the AFL-CIO, the Greenpeace, the National Organization for Women, Planned Parenthood, and so on, and also a range of much looser online movements such as 350.org and Hollaback. The coalition planned a coordinated march in multiple cities across the US and worldwide, and by the week before Trump's inauguration, there are more than 400 partner groupings listed on the Women's March website, and also a whole bunch of celebrities as well involved. Underway also was the Pussy Hat Project. This was a plan to knit hundreds of thousands of so-called pussy hats, bright pink winter caps with pointy ears that would immediately identify the protesters in photos and videos of the event. The pussy hats, of course, mischievously referenced the extraordinary Washington Post article featuring archival video outtakes that showed how, in an interview with a television presenter, Trump once bragged that such was his fame that women supposedly allowed him to, and I quote, grab them, unquote, by their pussies. The date for the march was set for January 21st, the day after the presidential inauguration. And the main US march, where people would wear the hats, would be taking place on the National Mall. So fast forward back, if you like, if that makes sense, back to the future, to January 21st, the day after the inauguration, Trump is scheduled to make a speech at CIA headquarters at Langley, Virginia, just outside Washington. And overnight, he discussed the size of his crowd with Sean Spicer. And of course, those of you who were following the campaign closely know that Donald Trump had several issues with various parts of his body, the size of which was speculated about during the campaign. But I'm not going to go into too much detail, but let's just say that this metaphor also plays into that debate as well. The goal, as far as Trump saw it, was to present the crowd photos as misinformation by hostile journalists, and to prime the news agenda when he was speaking to the CIA. Trump, yeah, that would be funny, wouldn't it? Let's get Trump to the ICA. So I wonder what he'd make of that. I'll be there. So Trump remarks on the size of the inauguration crowd in front of this small audience. Journalists start thinking, what's going on here? And start thinking about it. He said that there were 1.5 million people on the National Mall. The scene was set for Spicer's press briefing later that day. But as Trump was speaking to the CIA, literally, the Women's March protesters were already flooding the National Mall and the surrounding streets for the Washington node of a global event. Later that afternoon, Spicer walks out, gives the very first White House press briefing of the Trump era, before a room full of elite reporters from US media organizations and around the world. He says, journalists have been deliberately false reporting the inauguration. And he argued that media were aiming to lessen the enthusiasm of the inauguration, that's his phrase, by downplaying what he said was the real size of the inauguration crowd. And he mobilized a range of bizarre evidence for his case. You know, for instance, that the floor coverings that were used on the National Mall on the grass, which is the first time they'd been used, and they highlighted, because they were white, the open spaces. And without taking any questions, he just walked out of the room. So here was the new administration in its very first opportunity to engage media, accusing journalists of fabricating the claim that Trump's inauguration crowd was smaller than Obama's, despite clear photographic evidence. But Spicer's intervention was really based on the norms of a previous era, when scripted and staged press conferences that were designed for a select group of elite broadcast and newspaper journalists were relatively quick and easy ways to reclaim the agenda during a news cycle. Indeed, such events were often used to establish such cycles in the first place. Does this have the same kind of purchase today? I would say not. So journalists soon began to use social media to spread the news about Spicer's accusations that they'd underreported the size of the inauguration crowd. And meanwhile, the first reports of the Women's March started to appear on news organization websites and on television. The crowds were clearly enormous. So Spicer's attempt to solve the problem had made things worse. Photos and videos of the Washington March, broadcast on cable news channels, embedded on channel websites and YouTube, and pushed out via social media accounts, revealed that the protests had attracted greater numbers than the inauguration. So the Women's March turned out to be the largest single-day protest in US history, with 3.5 million participants across the country. Worldwide, an estimated 4.8 million people took part, and in Washington alone, there were about 470,000 that took to the streets. And there were marches in at least 81 other countries. And just as significant were the huge volumes of social media posts about the marches. Many of these, of course, included photos of crowded subways and streets and drew direct comparisons with the size of the crowd for the previous day's inauguration. And these were remediated in articles that aggregated and embedded the tweets on high-traffic news websites like BuzzFeed, for instance. So the extent of the physical embodied opposition to Trump in proximate form and recorded historical memory became the central point of contestation. And this was essentially a counter-inauguration. So what happens next is really interesting. Journalists start to sort of say, well, are we going to stand for this? The Washington Post commissioned their veteran political reporter, Glenn Kessler, to write a column for the fact-checker section of their paper, an extended piece effectively evaluating Spicer's claims. Now, this piece was an extraordinary piece of contemporary journalism. It managed to fuse traditional investigative judgment, eyewitness accounts, and expert testimony, all in the same story. So Kessler gathered material from a variety of journalists on the ground. He embedded their tweets, some of which featured photos that had been taken 4 years earlier and on the day of the inauguration. He even got evidence from 2 computer scientists who used algorithms that they developed to estimate crowd sizes for public safety purposes, to use those algorithms for the crowd size estimates on the National Mall. He demolished every single claim made by Trump and Spicer. The floor coverings on the Mall were not, in fact, new. They'd actually been used in 2013 for Obama's inauguration then. So that was a misclaim on the part of Spicer. A photo from 2013 by a CNN journalist, Ashley Killow, demonstrated this was the case. Trump's crowd didn't extend past 10th Street. Photo tweets from PBS and Washington Post reporters demonstrated this, and on it went. It's a terrific article, and he wrote it in essentially half a day. Now, when later that evening, Trump's senior advisor and campaign manager, Kellyanne Conway, appeared on NBC's Meet the Press, she issued this now infamous statement. She said that Spicer had merely used alternative facts to describe the inauguration. And this was met with incredulity by the host, Chuck Todd, who said, alternative facts are not facts, they're falsehoods. By then, it was clear that the administration's attempt to discredit journalists had failed. So in a period of just 2 days, the meaning of the inauguration had shifted. The Women's March was a tangible, visible, and literally massive manifestation of the opposition to Trump. The struggle to define the meaning of the inauguration crowd played out through a process of what I call mimetic metaphor claiming. Who owned the right to draw conclusions about the size and meaning of the crowds? The counter-inauguration was an emergent but decisively integrated assemblage of politicians, professional political staff, journalists, citizen activists assembled as crowds, NGOs, online political communities, mobile devices, social media platforms, websites, TV shows, and sporadically engaged members of the public. And crucially, it included the highly connected global networks of people who participated in the marches across the world. These geographically distant others were brought into close temporal proximity to the events in Washington by the affordances and uses of mobile digital media hardware and software. And this enabled them to become simultaneously a force acting in real time on the events in Washington, even though they weren't there, as well as on how those events were being mediated across the US and the world. So the highly global character of this assemblage, made manifest by the distant crowd's self-mediation via social media, was important in generating solidarity, enthusiasm, and momentum for those who were engaged in the marches in Washington and across the United States. So that through their acts of self-mediation and the remediation of these acts by journalists, these distant crowds were in effect pulled in to the center of the location that mattered, the National Mall. And here they became important ancillary evidence of the extent of the opposition to Trump. And in turn, they reinforced and enhanced the capacity and momentum of those in Washington eager to embarrass the president with a show of strength for the cause of women's rights. And in a virtuous circle of mediation, the story of the size of the women's marches also spurred on journalists whose news values were always likely to require that they show the audience the sheer size of the crowds. So the marchers capitalized on this framing, but democratized and distributed its agency by becoming embodied physical manifestations, a show of strength greater than Trump's supporters could assemble. And all the while, the marchers knew that their physicality, the pink hats, would in turn be mediated by those journalists, the ones who were looking to mobilize against Trump for calling them liars, effectively. So these actors cooperated to develop webs of meaning that would create the conditions for exercising power. These were the resources that enabled the power to define what the inauguration would come to symbolize. So for Trump, this should have been a period of discipline and control. Instead, it was characterized by disorganization, contestation, and chaos. So Spicer didn't solve his problem. Now, I said I'd start with some optimism. Unfortunately, things get a bit more depressing from here. I'm now going to talk about Trump's media strategy, and I'm also going to talk about his data campaign. If I have enough time, I'll get into some stuff about fake news and also social media bots and WikiLeaks as well. So essentially, Trump trumped professional media. Central to this was a media strategy, really, I would argue, that rather ruthlessly and rationally exploited the systemic interdependence between older and newer media, particularly social media and television. So Trump traveled from rally to rally, televised debate to televised debate, personally insulting other candidates, members of the crowd, journalists, celebrities, protesters, settling scores, stoking professional media coverage with an extraordinary litany of exaggerations, half-truths, distortions, lies about others in his own record. So this presented professional journalists with an acute dilemma. How should they report on a candidate who was willing to trample on so many of the established expectations about how politicians are supposed to behave in campaigns? So his strategy was to prime attention, and if this meant speeches based on racial slurs against immigrants, misogynistic attacks on women journalists, going beyond the realm of the facts, he saw that as a price worth paying. The response from elite journalism was either let's cover it, or let's highlight Trump's illiberalism with headlines full of outrage. Exactly the kind of coverage that an insurgent candidate needs. Now, in US campaigns, I've written a lot about this in the past, what we now see is a sort of systemic interdependence between TV, digital media, and face-to-face campaign events. The physical spectacle, the theatre of the big campaign event, the embodied experience, really matters still a great deal. And it's remediated by television and, of course, by social media activists, enabled activists who use mobile apps to record the experience. This theatricality attracts people and attracts journalists, and journalists go on the hunt for metrics that can show the enthusiasm that surrounds these events. Events also enable campaign managers to gather a lot of data about their activists as well. Let's just look at some basics to look at the engagement gaps between Clinton and Trump during this campaign. So this is from CrowdBabble and its overall engagements in Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So we're looking at overall across the campaign, from January the 1st, 2016 to November 2016, election day. Facebook, 208 million likes for Trump, Clinton, 72 million. I'll let you read that, it's pretty straightforward. Just look at the gaps. Of course, whether these were all authentic engagements is now open to much doubt. Maybe more on that later if I have time. This is from Jenny and Jeff Hemsley's project, which is a really useful sort of goldmine of data. They've done some really interesting content analysis. I really like this idea of share of voice that they've developed. So this looks at hashtags. You know, I'm with her, which is a Hillary hashtag. Make America Great Again, MAGA. How do we say it? M-A-G-A, MAGA. Who knows? Doesn't sound good either way, does it? But yeah, very Trumpian. So the idea is that, you know, the gap. It's not necessarily the absolute, it's the gaps. And this is Facebook during the final month. Again, this is from Katie Mayer at CrowdBabble. Instagram at the bottom, which is a longer period, January to November. Very difficult to see, I admit. The graphic's not very good, but if you look at how there's more blue on the right-hand side for Trump, it tells the story. So it's not just Twitter. But Twitter, of course, is important. Trump is an insurgent candidate, okay? He needs to break through. He's not part of the Republican establishment. He had lots of celebrity capital, but very little political capital. To translate celebrity capital into political capital and build support, he required coverage of any tone, I would argue, by professional media, particularly in the early stages of the Republican primaries, but also throughout the entire campaign. He had to demonstrate to editorial gatekeepers that he was a serious candidate for the presidency and that he would be a contender. Now, an important part of this is metrics. So metrics now, and this has only really happened literally over the last 3 or 4 years, and we've all watched it happen, no doubt. Metrics are now used as proxies for levels of interest that a candidate is generating among the public. They have a place in newsrooms alongside opinion polls and forecasting. So in 2016, social media logic starts to gel rather perfectly with older mass media organizational logic. And the result is always likely to be greater publicity for an insurgent as journalists go hunting for high-impact tweets that they can embed in their stories with a number of retweets, likes, and replies, all prominently displayed. How many times do we see that in 2016? So in a media system where these countless acts of engagement occur every second, there are some fields of activity where the specific tone of acts might not matter as much as just how those acts combine to produce sheer mass and ubiquity. So Trump's challenge was to get a foothold in the race and attract serious coverage, and social media, I would argue, were crucial in overcoming this challenge. And of course, I'm not the only person who's argued this. There wasn't a great deal of data-driven offline campaigning at the precinct level in the United States for Trump. But there was a lot of well-timed social media work that he knew would be circulated by both supporters and opponents alike. He also, of course, live tweeted Fox News. A lot of people have said, oh, Trump's live tweeting Fox News because he's woken up, he's got his pajamas on, he's eating his breakfast, he's watching TV. It's all random. I don't see that as random at all. I see it as a very purposive act of generating solidarity in real time with both conservative reporters at Fox News and activists who he knew would be watching. I don't see it as random. There's also a double movement here. There's a great authenticity of the guy who says what he thinks, but there's also the detachment that comes from the celebrity status. There's also a great deal of informality, what Gun Enley in an article that came out over the summer called deprofessionalization. So it's a transgression of the previous campaign norms. There's a lot of incivility, a lot of illiberalism, a lot of affect. However, there's very little interactivity with ordinary citizens. Again, Jenny's project at Syracuse shows that in quite a lot of detail. There's, the numbers of conversational tweets that you guys found were absolutely minuscule across the entire of the campaign. We also see reprofessionalization through the digital campaign war room. More on that soon. Just want to take a sideways move here and say a bit about how news had changed and how the right-wing news sphere in the US was playing an important role by the time we get to 2016. So Breitbart, of course, founded in 2007, but by 2016 it's in the top 50 most popular websites in the United States, according to Alexa. Flawed, but we don't have anything much better. It had more than 2.3 million Facebook followers and attracted 18 million homepage visitors a month during the campaign. And a further point here is a contextual one about the changing structure of attention online. By 2015, about 2/3 of Americans with a Facebook or Twitter account said that they turned to these platforms for news. And given that by 2015, nearly 2/3 of the US adult population used Facebook and about 20% used Twitter, these were important shifts. Also, by 2016, attention to news was less reliant on Google search and more reliant on the algorithms that distribute attention on social media platforms. Now, of course, we can't know all of the precise details of these because they're commercial secrets, and a lot of you are doing really great work on, deciphering all of this. But what we do know is that timing and engagement seem to matter. So posts that receive high levels of user engagement in the forms of shares, likes, comments, retweets over a short period of time are more likely to show up in users' feeds. And this creates all kinds of opportunities, a changed context, new audience expectations and behaviors that are ripe for a candidate like Trump, who wants to master the now integrated temporal rhythms of professional news media and social media sharing. Breitbart has become a huge part of the right-wing media system and the media system in the United States. This is a network visualization based on link sharing on Twitter of news stories from May 2015 to Election Day. It looks like it was done with Gephi. It was done by Robert Faris and colleagues, their study out of the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard on misinformation. It's now in its full version. I strongly recommend you take a look. It's very interesting. Look at the size of Breitbart. The nodes are sized by number of articles shared by Twitter users. If you like lists, there's Breitbart, but this time it's Facebook. Media sources most frequently shared on Facebook in the 2016 campaign. Breitbart number 3. What does this do? Well, it drives mainstream coverage to the nomination and beyond. It gives all of this the momentum that Trump built up through social media, and I could go into a lot more detail about this. gives him earned media coverage that radically reduces his campaign's need for paid advertising. And this earned media came despite Trump's poor showing in the early opinion polls and his almost complete neglect of campaign fundraising during the primary season. What matters here is not so much the absolute accuracy of this index, because it's based on an index by a company called MediaQuant, who work with the New York Times, but it's the gap between the candidates. This is monthly earned media by the time you get to February 2016. Trump well ahead. By the time you get to the end of the campaign, Trump had earned nearly $5 billion of ad-equivalent media coverage. Clinton had about $3.24 billion. Trump earned more than 3.5 times more coverage than Obama in 2012. Now, incumbents can always rely on lots of coverage in American campaigns. So if Trump is outstripping Obama by more than 3.5 times, that's pretty serious traction with mainstream media. What explains this? There's all kinds of theories doing the rounds right now. I just want to focus on one incredibly robust, well-composed study by colleagues Chris Wells and his team at University of Wisconsin-Madison. It's an article that came out in Political Communication last year. They take the hybrid media system framework and they apply it in a really nice, empirically grounded way. The big question here is, can we demonstrate that Trump's tweets led to greater news coverage, or was it the other way around? You know, did news coverage of Trump lead to people tweeting and retweeting Trump? It's a really important causal question, but it's a really difficult causal question to answer, as we know, given the complexity of our media environment. So what Chris Wells and his colleagues did was they built a hybrid data set. They looked at the delegate count, in other words, how many primary delegate wins he had. Retweet was usually a predictor of increased coverage. Retweets of Trump's tweets, the timings of the debates on TV during the primaries, the rallies that Trump held, interviews, press conferences, unscheduled media appearances. This was Trump's habit of calling into television talk shows as if he was a member of the audience. Extraordinary, we've never seen that before. And it guaranteed him a huge amount of airtime in a very sort of confrontational way as well. And they also looked at stories in the Washington Post, the New York Times, other newspapers, and blogs at the New York Times and the Washington Post as well. They did some fancy statistical analysis. I won't bore you with the details. They used time series data. They used Granger causality, which allows you to isolate the effects of something that happens at point A on point B. And they use autoregression, which is a common technique in panel studies to control for the values at time 1 by entering those into the regression model and seeing how they play in explanations of what happens at time 2. So what they found is this, that increases in retweets of Trump's tweets were anterior to increases in news articles and blog posts. Increases in news articles and blog posts about Trump weren't anterior to increases in retweets of Trump's tweets. Trump was more likely to post tweets when he was not getting much coverage to kind of stoke the fires. And Trump's news and blog coverage also increased when he held staged media events, press conferences, rallies, interviews, and calling into those talk shows unannounced. There was no relationship between Trump's delegate count, the wins he was racking up, and the amount of coverage he received. In other words, there was no growing support framing, which you often see. So in other words, social media were important in driving the mainstream media agenda. Not exclusively, they integrated with the television appearances and the staged rallies as well. So it's the hybrid media system model. So this wasn't really disintermediation. Remember our old friend disintermediation? This was really intermediation. You know, Trump wasn't using social media to bypass professional media. He was using social media to influence professional media. And I want to talk a little bit about Trump's data campaign and the switch to Facebook advertising, which is only recently, over literally the last 4 or 5 weeks, it seems that people have gradually woken up to this big story over the past month or so, but it was there, if you look hard enough, all the way through the summer of last year, 2016. So I think there are 2 myths about Trump's digital campaign. One is that he didn't really have a digital operation. A lot of people said this at the time. Oh, it's chaotic, he's going nowhere, he doesn't know what he's doing, he's got no staff around him. Clinton and the Democrats are going to win because they've mastered this. The second myth, however, which kind of pushes against the first one, is that the idea that Trump used psychometrics or psychographics, as they're often known, systematically. In other words, personality type scoring. There's no real evidence of that having occurred. There is a great deal of evidence of sophisticated data operation in which Cambridge Analytica, the company involved, played a role, but there's not much evidence that I can find yet anyway about psychometrics being used systematically. So this is Brad Parscale on the right here. Did I really need to say that? He was the target of dismissive accounts of Trump's digital operation because he was a family friend of Trump and he worked for a San Antonio, Texas firm that built websites for companies, including Trump's own. Apparently he offered to build a campaign website for Trump for $1,500 and Trump gave him the job. But as always, there's a longer-term context. There's always a longer-term context now with digital politics. The Republican National Committee spent $100 million between 2012 and 2014 improving its infrastructure. Once the primary season was over, the RNC merged its gigantic email list with Trump's list and donated 12 support staff to the Trump campaign. It also agreed to raise money for Trump. Over the summer of 2016, Trump's email list grew very rapidly indeed and was larger than Clinton's, according to Return Path, the email analytics company, by the end of the campaign. Trump also funded up to 100 new employees for Parscale's firm, which already had a staff of 60. Parscale started spending money on Facebook ads, and in August 2016, with over 100 digital staff in place, Trump hires a data science firm, Cambridge Analytica, and Steve Bannon, the director of Breitbart News. By the campaign's end, Parscale had spent $90 million on Facebook ads, the highest total ever. Clinton spent $30 million. Trump also spent a larger proportion of his campaign budget on digital than did Clinton. He was commissioning polls from Trump Tower all the time. Parscale was spending about $100,000 a week on voter surveys. This all enabled Cambridge Analytica, the data scientists, to build models from email lists, voter files, and Facebook ad tests to identify about 13.5 million swing voters in 16 states that they argued could be persuaded potentially to vote for Trump. Now, this is a quotation from Matt Oskowski, who works for Cambridge Analytica. He said this in public at Google's post-election review. You can watch the video on YouTube. He said, we actually didn't do any psychographics with the Trump campaign. So we've got to bear that in mind. But what I'm talking about here is the stuff of digital campaigning that has been developed, as Jenny knows all too well, because she's written about this in great deal, as has Daniel Kreis, since 2004. This has been a whole industry that has emerged and developed. But what was different here was Trump's innovation with Facebook advertising. They averaged about 40 to 50,000 Facebook ads per day, and that comes from Lindsay Walters, who worked for the Republican National Committee. They also integrated the televised debate messages that Trump was issuing while he was speaking live on TV with Facebook ads. That's something that really started with Obama in 2008, by the way, and was used to some effect in the 2010 UK general election as well, interestingly. During the final TV debate on October the 19th, 175,000 ad variations were published on this day. What enabled this were platform changes. So in 2014, Facebook opens its API to consumer data broker firms like Datalogix, Experian, Axiom. And these firms can now help campaigns match Facebook accounts to emails, full names, addresses, and phone numbers that they get, the campaigns do, when they sign people up as supporters at rallies. Previous to this, the success rate for matching Facebook IDs with emails was really low, about 30%. Still pretty high if you think about the numbers. By 2014, this increased to 65 to 85%, according to Daniel Kreis's research. So Trump could target Facebook advertising to members of their email lists, also using this lookalike audiences tool. Lookalike audiences, for those of you who aren't familiar with Facebook marketing, allows you to look up people. You take people who've got certain profiles, interests, expressed interests, of course, with Facebook, and behavioral traits. And you can find people who have similar interests and target for a fee your campaign at those people. So you can grow your constituency of potential targets for ads very quickly and very accurately with lookalike audiences. Because these people are literally people who are similar to the people who you know have already signed up to your list. So if these people are not going to show up at your rallies, why not just target them with Facebook ads? You know that they're not engaged enough to come out to the rallies, but they might be engaged enough to vote and vote for your candidate. And then we have the famous dark posts as well, which have almost entered mythology over recent weeks. By the way, this chapter that I wrote went to press on March the 20th. So, you know, if you find anything in the chapter that, you know, very recent events has rendered redundant, please do email me and tell me. But I think it stands up pretty well. Dark posts were essentially ways for first of all, Facebook staff we now know were embedded in the campaign. Okay, this is a revelation that started to leak out in the early part of the year as some of us were going to workshops where there were representatives from Google and Facebook there, and it emerged that they'd been on the inside helping Trump target ads and master the platform. The key point about dark posts is that they don't appear in the campaign's Facebook page. They appear in your feed if you've been targeted with an ad, but somebody who logs in and just looks at the Trump homepage doesn't see these posts. And this means that you can have a sort of industrial scale ad operation that's targeted at individuals and their feeds. Now, of course, none of this guarantees that people will click on these, that even, you know, they'll even pay attention. But if you're trying to target people, it's quite a sophisticated mechanism. And of course, campaigns can A/B test multiple slightly different versions of the same ad to identify which produce the highest engagement. And dark posts have higher click-through rates than boosted posts, which is another way to pay to boost your content on Facebook, because people don't see them as spam. Now, the important thing here is that dark posts were part of what Cambridge Analytica openly called, in an interview with Bloomberg reporters Josh Green and Sasha Eisenberg, voter suppression. So they said, you know, we have three major voter suppression operations underway. They're aimed at three groups Clinton needs to win overwhelmingly: idealistic white liberals, young women, and African Americans. And my text there in the red, to sort of put this in context of how they synchronized it with television events and radio. During the TV debate of October 19th, Trump's invocation at the debate of Clinton's WikiLeaks emails and support for the TPP was designed to turn off Sanders supporters. The parade of women who say they were sexually assaulted by Bill Clinton and harassed or threatened by Hillary is meant to undermine her appeal to young women. And her 1996 suggestion that some African-American males are, quote, super predators is the basis of a below-the-radar effort on talk radio to discourage infrequent black voters from showing up at the polls, particularly in Florida. Now, this is Alexander Nix, the CEO of Cambridge Analytica, and there's a video of him giving this talk on YouTube. I've circled this for you here, top left of their dashboard. This is the dashboard they used with the Ted Cruz campaign that they then adapted for the Trump campaign when Ted Cruz was out of the race. Disengagement targets is what that says, top left. So they were clearly doing this. Did it actually work? Okay, so as a social scientist, of course, it's impossible to say with absolute certainty. There are so many different variables that weigh in electoral success. But we do know that compared with Obama in 2012, support for Clinton declined among African Americans due to an increase in the numbers of African Americans who did not vote, they didn't turn out. When you couple this with the increase in rural white working class supporters who voted Trump, this small drop in turnout may have made a difference, especially in states like Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Florida, where the margins were absolutely razor thin. But of course, there were many other reasons why Clinton would have proved less popular. And there were the introduction also of new voter ID laws in some states, which dissuaded some African Americans from voting. So we've got to be careful. But I would say that the study of this kind of stuff is now, I would say, I don't go so far as to say it's an urgent moral imperative for anybody who's interested in the distribution of power in our society to start examining this kind of stuff in much more careful detail than we've done before, so we can hold both the platforms and the data science firms to account. On that note, I just want to finish with some even darker reflections that I call dysfunctional hybridity. First of all, the fakes. We've got the fakes, the bots, and the hacks. Sorry, I do like a catchy title. First, the fakes. There's so much to be said about fake news, but I want to just point out a few dimensions of it that speak to it as a systematic problem. So this is about exploiting the affordances and the incentive structures of social media platforms, online search engines, and the broader news media industry to spread fabricated information for financial or political gain. So really this is a systemic problem. It's not going to go away with a technological fix, I would argue. So the underlying technologies, first of all, that make news sites look and function the way they do have been radically democratized, much more than we'd ever thought. This is the Denver Guardian story. This is a fake story. Okay, a lot of people, this is one of the most shared stories during the campaign on Facebook. This is WordPress, where it prominently highlights how lots of professional media organizations use its blogging platform. They look alike to a lot of people. The fake news factories also required raw materials. I mentioned earlier the new right-wing news sites with their different take on the news, shall we say. The fake news factories used a mix of plagiarized bits and pieces of other articles spliced together with added images and headlines as well as outright fabrication. A lot of the raw material came from these sites. It's a systemic problem. Facebook was hugely important for the growth of these right-wing sites, particularly Breitbart, after 2008. And in a bitterly polarized partisan struggle, supporters of Trump and Clinton wanted to generate solidarity by sharing news that they hoped would show their opponents in the worst possible light. And of course, as we know, Facebook's business model is heavily based upon the idea of sharing among like-minded networks of individuals and family. Google's ad syndication platform incentivizes advertisers to create content targeted to specific online audiences, in this case, partisans. And that ad platform is often blind to the authenticity of the websites whose audience it sells to its advertisers. The new patterns of news consumption that are dependent upon real-time, often affective interventions in the news cycle also mattered here. In an era where we have always-on news through our mobile devices and we have limited time and attention, the tendency, you ever done this? Retweet without reading the linked article? There's a data science project did 18 months ago. Did you see this paper? It said that up to 50% of people retweet articles where they haven't clicked on the link because of the headline. Some fascinating work to be done in future on all of this. And of course, news organizations have learned to compete by using clickbait. This is, my favorite is the bottom here, why BuzzFeed doesn't do clickbait. Yeah. Nothing like a bit of postmodern irony. But of course, it's not just them. It's reputable older media organizations who now dump algorithmically generated ads and clickbait stories from so-called content recommendation companies at the bottom of news pages. Poor quality clickbait stories from around the web. Companies like Outbrain, Taboola, Rev Content. You seen any of these? They drive me crazy. But look, you know, this is the stuff. And Google and Facebook, of course, have become vast, sprawling, and above all, arcane mega platforms. They are arcane in ways that they weren't when they first started. Okay, a lot of commercial secrecy in the early days, but things have changed as they've become much more sophisticated and much more complicated, and they are part of the texture of the web in ways that simply wasn't the case even 6 or 7 years ago, I would argue. So I want to say a little bit about bots and WikiLeaks, and then I'll be quiet. Social media bots. What about the bots? Well, I've done quite a lot of work recently on dual screening of political debates. As dual screening has become more popular, we've seen a lot more authentic engagement around this. People using mobile devices to comment on the news, comment on a debate in real time. It's become a huge, huge part of media events in the political sphere, and not just the political sphere as well. But the 2016 campaign also revealed a surprising proportion of the social media discourse generating during the campaign, during the debates, was inauthentic, the product of automated and semi-automated social media bots whose masters sought to shape perceptions of the debate. So this is some terrific research that's come out from Bence Kalanyi, Phil Howard, and Sam Woolley at the Oxford Internet Institute. So just give you a flavour of how this worked with the 2016 first debate. About 39% of the debate tweets carried pro-Trump hashtags. 13.6% carried pro-Clinton hashtags. 32.7% of the tweets using the pro-Trump hashtags came from bots and highly automated accounts. Highly automated defined as more than 50 tweets per day during those 4 days that they studied the data. 22.3% of tweets with pro-Clinton hashtags were from bots or highly automated accounts. Trump had a much larger botnet army than Clinton. Again, this is the stuff we really need to be paying attention to from now on. You know, gone are the days where we can naively, unless we're doing survey work, which we've tried to do very carefully, so you're asking people about their experiences. It's strange in a way. You almost have to step back from the big data picture and start asking people again what they're doing when they're online, sharing stuff on social media and participating in the debate. Because we can't rely simply on the face value of, certainly not of Twitter anyway, because there's so much bot activity on the platform, which is really sad because it's absolutely my favorite platform. Finally, I just want to say a bit about WikiLeaks. Finally, the hacks. Remember this from the second televised debate, one of the most extraordinary moments in US campaign television history. Clinton says it's good that someone with the temperament of Donald Trump is not in charge of the law in this country. Trump, standing close behind her, says, "Because you'd be in jail." Unusually, Trump's remark is met with immediate applause from the studio audience. They're not allowed to applaud, but they did. They broke out into spontaneous applause. Imagine that. The audience wasn't small. It was 67 million Americans watching that moment. Absolutely dreadful for Clinton. Just a few days before the actual voting itself, the FBI Director James Comey announces to Congress that he's investigating a new batch of emails that's relevant to a previously closed investigation into Clinton's private email server that she ran while she was Secretary of State in the Obama administration. And that's dynamite too. What enables this? Well, lots of things. But unfortunately, a prime mover in this is WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks is a different beast by the time you get to 2016. It's morphed again. I've written a great deal about WikiLeaks in the past. It's morphed once more. Having given up mostly on its earlier hybrid strategy of collaborating with professional media organizations to promote transparency in the public interest, WikiLeaks has switched to dumping unredacted, often personal information from a single individual's email account, John Podesta, without any clearly defined transparency goal other than to undermine Clinton's candidacy. But then again, if you think about it, it's actually just a different means of fulfilling its older role. It integrates with hackers and with professional media. And the John Podesta, who worked for the Democratic National Committee, the DNC, and Hillary Clinton's campaign, those email leaks give journalists lots of fresh evidence to write about Clinton's personal character. The message is clear enough. Clinton's principles were in doubt. And this coverage, I would argue, contributes to further divisions in the Democrats' voter base and activist base. So a Pew survey found that 15% of Sanders supporters, for instance, in the middle of 2016, would not vote for Clinton. Navin Nayak, who was Clinton's head of polling, went on the record after the election and said, "We think that the email issue cost us the election because it turned off our core support among college-educated white voters." And of course, what were WikiLeaks doing as well? They were influencing Trump. So in Florida, on July 26, 2016, extraordinary. You can watch the video on YouTube. Trump, "I will tell you this, Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing." At Wilkes Barre in Pennsylvania on October the 10th, Trump shouts, "I love WikiLeaks." He mentioned WikiLeaks 164 separate times during the final month of the campaign. This is a US presidential candidate Has he not got more important things to talk about? And of course, there's a much bigger picture here that only now the details are emerging of. CIA evidence starts to mount up December and January after the election of Russian intelligence alleged involvement in the Fancy Bears and the Guccifer 2.0 attacks that led to the leaks of the emails. So what's going on? A foreign state has allegedly developed the power to intervene in an American election, but diffusely and indirectly. This is a global assemblage of lax security, email servers, databases, fake websites. Poor John Podesta was sent with a phishing email to a fake Google login page that looked identical to his Google email account, Gmail, logged in, and the hackers had his password and username. So there's human frailty, state action, the Russians, the incentives that drive professional media, and finally, revenge. But I want to end on one note of optimism. That was a global assemblage. But remember too, that the counter-inauguration and the Women's March was a global assemblage as well. And it laid the foundations on which online activist networks in the future and future mobilization will depend. Thanks very much for listening. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. This was absolutely splendid. And luckily for us, we have still some time for questions and comments. So if anyone has a question to Professor Chadwick, then yes. Just a second, there will be a microphone.
Hello, I'm a PhD student. My name's Kathy Maggs from Sydney. And I was wondering about your, because I don't think you elaborated, and if you didn't, and if you did, I'm sorry, I must have missed it, about the adjective arcane when you were talking about Google and Facebook. If you could just elaborate a bit on why they are arcane.
Yeah. Sure. So I'm just trying to make the point, I suppose, that what's happened over the last 10 years is that the professionalization of online marketing, some of this has been driven by election campaigns, incidentally, but now, of course, it's a whole industry, and it's part of the commercial media sectors of every country around the world. Means that the skills required to operate on the web in an effective way when it comes to advertising and, dare I say, even persuasion, has become the province of a select few in comparative terms. So I guess what I'm doing is, and it was really interesting because we had in a session that I was in this afternoon, Tartu Gillespie, who was talking about how, in a sense, what we maybe need to do is sort of think in terms of how platforms differ from what we thought the web was going to be like in, say, the mid-2000s before platforms emerged. So I guess what I've got at the back of my mind here as a kind of old-timer here, you know, started studying this stuff 17, 18 years ago, is a model of the internet which is based upon a relatively open, transparent, kind of amateurish model. And that model actually was there in the early days of campaigning. And strangely enough, what's happened is that as platforms have taken over the web experience or the online experience for large numbers of people, you know, there are people now who just don't spend any time online apart from Facebook or apart from Twitter. Maybe Twitter less so, but certainly Facebook. So that's part of it. The second part of it is all of the tracking technologies and the ad targeting technologies that not just Facebook, that Google, of course, have built into their ad syndication models, their AdSense platform, which now means, you know, the simple phenomenon of the way that ads follow you around the web, you know, I mean, that simply didn't happen 7 or 8 years ago when banner ad technology was primitive compared to how it is now. But certainly the advertising capacities of Facebook as a platform, the use of dark posts, the use of lookalike audiences, the bringing together of lots of different sources of data into one point. I mean, Cambridge Analytica always talks about there being 5,000 data points on the average American. Now, it's playing fast and loose with language there because it's dealing with samples, but it likes to extrapolate to all American voters. So it's that kind of, when I say arcane, it's beyond the knowledge of, well, first of all, it's beyond the knowledge of people who don't understand the statistical analysis and the probabilities and the algorithmic determinants of how attention is harvested. But secondly, and probably more importantly, because there are plenty of people in this room who do understand the technology of this, right? Data scientists. But most importantly, unless you're a data scientist working inside the platform, you don't get privileged access. So that's what I mean by arcane. It's a bit of a sort of old-fashioned British word, isn't it, arcane? But thanks.
Yeah, there was a question at the back.
Luke Stark, Dartmouth College. Thank you for this. I hope it was instructive for the non-North American or non-Americans in the room, because while it was indeed a splendid, it gave a lot of post-traumatic flashbacks for somebody who was living through it. My question is about behavioral targeting and psychometrics. You've mentioned that, and I agree that Cambridge Analytica's claims about its ability to actually perform specifically what you would call psychometric targeting is maybe a little overblown. But throughout the rest of the talk, you do iterate all the ways in which Facebook collects data about behavior and even personality in ways that are essentially like psychometrics, right? So I'm wondering how you see the role of these kind of behavioral sciences and mental health questions, impacting the system of power and politics. Because I think, and I've written about this myself a little bit, that they will become increasingly important to computer science as we go forward.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the chapter in the book, I do make the point that this really is likely to take off. You make an excellent point, however, about, in a sense, the psychometrics, the stuff about the 6 personality types, is pretty crude compared to what Facebook knows about you from your expressed clicking around and what you share. So in that regard, I think you're absolutely spot on. I think, in a sense, that, you remember what caused the controversy was the article by 2 German journalists, I believe, in Das Magazin, which is a German news outlet, that was then republished in English. And when that hit, it seemed to provide all the answers, and it was written in a wonderful style as well. It was almost like a whodunit, it was like a detective story. But you've really, really got to read that piece carefully, because they really are playing fast and loose with a lot of insinuation, and they don't outright say that it was Kozinski who was at Cambridge, or that Cambridge University had anything to do with it, with their psychometric models. Remember from their Facebook app? Remember the Facebook app, My Personality? Well, this is where this is the origin of this so-called psychometric targeting model, because they invited people to install it voluntarily and give their consent. Remember the good old days of 2007, 2008? Facebook, it's My Personality, it's really fun. I'm going to participate in this. Well, they were harvesting literally tens of thousands of these surveys. And what that article did was it sort of said that this was integrated into the models that Cambridge Analytica were using, and it insinuated, but it didn't directly state, that they had got access to the data. So we've got to be careful here with all of these allegations. But I think your remark about what Facebook already knows and how it's opened up its API to data harvesting firms that already operate in the space of understanding consumer behavior, what cars people drive, what magazines they read. In the United States context, the regulatory environment for this is a lot looser than it is in many European countries, and certainly in Britain. So I think you make an excellent point, and I think that really we probably need to be asking more questions about that than we do about psychometric targeting personality types. One final point on that is that you might be able to isolate people's personality types, so you might be able to say somebody's extrovert or somebody, but it's then, how do you craft a political message that taps into that? And that's, I think, where the big division is still there, because it still requires experienced campaign managers who've got lots of knowledge to translate these models of personality types into campaign messages. that will work in a Facebook ad, or are more likely to work, of course. Yeah.
Yes, there's a question here.
Yeah, thank you so much for this presentation. My name is Johan Farkas, and I'm from the IT University of Copenhagen. And I just wanted to, I think there were so many, of course, interesting things in this presentation, but one thing you talked about, of course, a lot this relationship, for instance, that Trump, this idea of Trump walking around at home watching Fox and tweeting that this is, of course, a stage thing, but at the same time, I came to think about this inauguration photo. The interesting thing to me is that this is actually Trump playing on some very old media logics in the sense that journalists still today like to think of themselves as objective, reporting the facts. So him, I mean, whether it was the biggest crowd or not has nothing to do with his politics. It will not affect anything, but he knows that if they play on this, that will be the main coverage because of the logics of the old media, right? And I think this is yeah, again, just to kind of, I don't know if there's a question here or just kind of a comment, but I think it's so interesting that we both see Trump being incredibly talented at using social media logics, but also these very old style. I think this inauguration photo is interesting, and it's also interesting that we're talking about it today because it's just easy. It's easy to fact check, and journalists like that, and probably scholars as well. But I mean, it's probably the least important part of his presidency in some way, how many people were there.
Okay, right, so it depends how many sort of circles of hell we want to descend into here. You know, if you're going to say, okay, Trump actually loved the idea that the size of his crowd was challenged in such a symbolically and physically powerful way by a demonstration because it would generate media coverage that then his supporters would say, you know, point the finger and say, of course, they're biased. Now, I think that there's a lot of truth in that, you know, so one mistake I probably make with this big optimistic opening here is to assume that everybody buys this. Of course they don't, because Trump, although you've got to remember his approval ratings are only 40%, the lowest ever for an incoming president. But there are a lot of Trump partisans who would point the finger at the Washington Post and Glenn Kessler and say, this is typical. This is, you know, coastal liberals. We don't recognize this. So I think you're absolutely right on that. But whether or not it was deliberate, you know, whether or not Trump deliberately stoked the fires of a potentially very negative story, and I would argue a very negative story because it galvanized liberals against him in a way that would not have happened. You know, without the big women's march, there wouldn't have been such an important show of strength that would have then laid the foundations for future mobilization against Trump. It put the administration right on the back foot. You know, speaking as a political communications scholar, you know, there's a great deal of literature and case studies over the years of how not seizing the agenda early on can make a big difference to how successful you are. And, you know, and a few weeks later, the Trump travel ban was overturned by judges. And who knows what we're going to see? You know, his legislative program is not doing particularly well. I'm not laying all of this at the door of the Women's March, but what I'm saying is that it destabilized the administration right from the off. And it became a hugely powerful moment. And I would say that the Kessler article, on its own, you're absolutely right. It doesn't, I'm not saying, oh, journalism as hero. What I'm saying is that that piece of journalism at the elite level, one of the nation's oldest, finest newspapers, integrated with what was going on the ground and in the social media expression, both in the States and around the world, came together and integrated. So that's the hybrid media system in a way. It's about elite media, it's about physical space, it's also about social media and how that can change in the moment political outcomes.
So looking
Now, I
at...
recognise that I'm between you and drinks, I believe. So, and thinking about the time, and I'm not sure what time the reception begins. Sorry for taking over, but
I think we have time for 2 more questions.
2 more questions.
I'll
keep
try
it
to
brief.
keep it short. Thank you for this talk. My question is, can we expect, or are we already seeing Democrats and liberal campaigns using some of these strategies, and is that really what we want? Is that ethical? Like, how do we, like, where do we go from here? Because we see that, you know, what works for the Tea Party, oh, those are good strategies, let's start using them. I mean, do you think that this is now like the strategy to win a campaign, or is there a different future in which the Democrats don't just reproduce what I would consider some rather unethical strategies?
That's a great question. I think there are 2 answers to that. One is that yes, it will happen, because American electoral politics is absolutely cutthroat. And you've got 2 candidates where the margins are razor thin. Where the margins are thin, data science methods, I would argue, tend to have more impact overall, because you can switch things in a very small way, but it makes a difference because of the electoral college system of the United States. So I think we're going to see it, no doubt. Whether I want to see it, absolutely I don't. What I'd like to go back to, if I had the choice, was the model, a rather naive, open, kind of transparent model, which was a combination of the old war room model, but it was in 2004 with Howard Dean. This is how we ended up on this journey where some of us studied, Jenny and I studied that campaign and looked at it and thought, wow, this is the future of the internet and politics. It was a lot more naive, it was a lot more open, and look at it, naive is the word. That's the model, the spirit of the model that I'd like to see revived. But unfortunately, given what happened with Brexit, given what's happened in other elections recently, with the role of data science and platforms and don't get me wrong, look, I'm not pointing the finger of blame at all platforms or platforms in general. I'm just saying that they have a role to play as well. And so I think my ideal would be to have a different kind of online campaigning that is more based in the spirit of the open web.
Okay, so the final question of today. Who would like to take this opportunity?
You said about the dark post. I just want to know what's the relations, if there is, between the dark post and the normal post and the bots that were used in the elections.
Well, I mean, from what we know, Trump was using dark posts for targeted ads a lot more than Clinton and a lot more than simple open posts on his Facebook page. So the problem is we don't know because Facebook won't tell us. And Facebook won't tell us because they say it's a proprietary secret and it's all part of their data that they own. And I don't know if you've been following the struggles of a researcher called Jonathan Albright over recent days, as he has managed to try and identify lots of new fake news circulating and troubling, polarizing hate speech on Facebook as a platform. And Facebook responded by deleting all of the material and denying access to it. And he's been involved in quite a lively debate about that picked up quite a lot of traction. So to cut a long story short, we really don't know. With Twitter and the bots, Twitter is a more open, generous platform, but even they now have turned on my good friend and colleague, Phil Howard. Last week they issued a press release trying to discredit his research, saying that it wasn't based on the full Firehose API. How many times have we heard this? And that because they use the streaming API, that their data were incomplete, and that they didn't understand how Facebook acts behind the scenes to reduce the numbers of automated posts. So I think we're at a real crossroads here. I really do. I mean, my next book is called Social Media and the Future of Democracy. I've started on that now, and I'm trying to address this whole debate head on. I think we've got a crisis, a real crisis of democratic authenticity when it comes to platforms. And I can't see the problem going away anytime soon. So I wish I could answer you, directly, but we need to call Facebook.
Okay, so I think on that note, please join me in thanking